I'm getting involved in an engagement, there's three things that I generally look at. One is, do they have a realistic expectation of their valuation? Secondly, do I feel like the deal is transactable? And then the third is this a good person?
Welcome to a brand new episode of the M&A Mastermind podcast presented by Cornerstone International Alliance. I'm your host, Nick Olson. On this show, I get the opportunity to talk with the brightest minds in lower middle market M&A. Together, we discuss industry intelligence, deal management, shared successes, specialized expertise, and much more. If you serve the small to medium-sized business owner, this show will offer you tactics and insights you can use and implement now to become a master in M&A. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a brand new episode of the M&A Mastermind podcast. My guest today is the co-founder and CEO of CEO 360 and the managing partner of Cardiff Advisory, a boutique investment bank and strategic advisory firm serving the life sciences and healthcare companies. He has more than 30 years of buy and sell side experience in the M&A space, advising hundreds of transactions across North America, Europe, and Asia. Former professional minor league baseball player, and has two Labrador retrievers named Salt and Pepper. And from what I understand, yes, one's white, one's black. Hence the names. Please welcome my guest today, David Crean. David, how you doing today?
Good. Thank you very much, Nick, for inviting me into your podcast and into your world.
Awesome. I'm excited to have you. You're very much an accredited podcast guest and very much an expertise in our topic here today in the life sciences and healthcare space. But I want to go back to the intro. You played professional baseball. I'm very much a baseball guy. What was that experience like?
It was awesome. It was my plan A, and then plan A fell apart because my niece decided, dude, you got to, go get a real job. So my knees, I suffered a, career-ending injury, and 5 surgeries later, I now have metal in my knee. So, it was devastating at the time, but what a great experience. I mean, to do something you've always loved, to grow up playing baseball and just being a sports athlete myself, but just, regardless of baseball, it was awesome. It really brings out the competitiveness, but doing something you really truly love, whether that's an athlete, or in athletics or anything else, it's amazing. So,
yeah. Is there one thing in your baseball career that stands out as like a really cool accomplishment situation?
Throwing the ball to Don Mattingly. He was the first baseman.
Oh, wow.
How's that?
How many people can say that?
Yeah, so it was awesome. No, look, it's just great to get up and play, sports literally every day. It was amazing. As a minor league ball player, you're not really making a hell of a lot of money, but it was fun.
Mm-hmm. So now to your real job.
Yeah, exactly.
So
plan B.
Let's go to plan B. So you are, managing partner at Cardiff Advisory Services. Tell us about your firm, maybe a little bit about your background, and what got you into this space.
Yeah, thanks so much. Cardiff Advisory is a boutique life M&A firm. I'm FINRA registered with my 79 and 63. We focus exclusively on life science and healthcare deals. That's our swim lane. We don't go outside of it. We're also doing a lot of valuation work as well. So we do partnering and valuation work. As I mentioned, it's a great business. We're in that low to mid market. So let's just say anything 250 million enterprise value and below, where I find, at least in the life science and healthcare space, it's a great market. You have to really be specialized in it. So I'm not a generalist. And I find that the competition is really CEOs who feel like they can do it themselves. They don't need to hire a banker to go out and do it. And unfortunately, what happens when that happens is that, they take their eye off the ball and things just kind of fall apart, or they're not maximizing the value. So that's why I started it about 6 years ago. Prior to that, I was with another boutique firm and, just starting up the life science practice within a generalist firm. So it was really great. Currently scaling the company and bringing on other bankers and other people to help with valuation and marketing the firm. So very, very exciting. By way of background, I have a PhD in biophysics and a master's degree in oncology. I started going down this route in a pre-med in a bachelor's, and I got my MBA along the way in finance. So it's a really great rare combination of sort of scientific rigor and financial expertise, which really blends really well, in the M&A practice.
How does that is a very unique skill set you have. How does that benefit, you know, you and your firm and then your clients too? Because like you said, you're very much industry focused and you're not a generalist. I would imagine it's just because of your background, really specializing in that space and understanding that a lot. But I would imagine it helps out your firm in general, but also your clients as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can sit down in a room with, the PhDs, the scientists, the chief medical officer, and talk smack on science and medicine, and then quickly look over the other way. And there's the FP&A guys, the CFOs, and we can have a conversation about IRR and discounted cash flow, and without without saying, let me bring in my finance team to do that, right? So it's a really, that's where I call it, it's a real rare combination of that financial expertise with being able to talk science and medicine, and understanding that, and then helping translate that into what the business case is and why you need to take a look at this from either a buyer perspective or what is the seller's case to the buyer or prospective buyers.
And I would imagine you've won pitches because of your, expertise in that space and your background, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I find the majority of my pitches are actually going up against CEOs who don't want to hire either a bulge bracket or a mid-market company, and they're like, "Hey, I need somebody who's a real specialist to come in." But a lot of times, the questions will turn to, "David, I'm sold on you. That's great. You can help tell the story that we really struggle with. Beyond you, who's helping out on this engagement?" That's generally what the question is. So I'll
Hmm.
talk about the team, and if I don't have the right team member, I'll go out and bring in a 1099, for example, to help out with telling the story or to execute. So it's really important because I'm on every engagement. I'm not giving it off to a bunch of 22-year-old junior analysts who are calling, the CEO of Moderna or Pfizer. It's me. And
Hmm.
so that's an important component as a boutique, just like in many boutiques on that low to middle market. The managing director, the partners, they're doing a lot of the work as well. They're on every engagement.
Yeah.
So I try not to, let's call that, shot that over, hand it over to a junior analyst.
Right. It's funny that you bring that up because it's a topic of conversation that we have all the time in our group is, you as, and I would imagine you're considered the rainmaker, you're bringing in most of the deals. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's primarily, my network, my experience at selling it. And then I spend the majority of time talking about beyond me. How are we going to be successful, and how are we going to work together?
Hmm. How do you look at that from just the firm, your firm's perspective too, with, a lot of knowledge and experience and the network is all tied into yourself. What does that next step look like or phase look like for your firm? Have you thought a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm actually going through it right now in terms of scaling, because I don't want it to be, it's you and Nick, as you and I always look at M&A deals, it's like concentration issue is a big risk, right? When
Hmm.
you're trying to sell a company and trying to explain that to the buyer, oh, don't worry about it. It's not a concentration risk. I too am looking at, all right, there's a concentration risk. I hold all the institutional knowledge. Now we have to scale beyond David. And so I'm, looking at bringing in bankers and other analysts, marketing people, whatever. I have to scale the business just like any business owner would look to do. So I'm currently going through that because I don't want this to be a concentration risk that, oh, David, he got sick today and he can't do anything. That's like no bueno, right? So
Right.
that's the issue that we're going through right now.
Hmm.
I like where it's going, but
Yeah.
the idea is to scale this beyond me. And it's a great brand. It's a great focus for the business. And frankly, I want it to be successful.
Beyond you whenever you decide to go and
Absolutely.
retire or whatever.
Yeah, I might say like, hey, I'm not, I'm not really a deal junkie. I want to bring in deal junkies. I can bring in the deals, but I also want to grow it and well beyond me and utilize my skill set of building a business, not just focusing on doing deals all the time.
All right, Dave. So let's start, kind of with the industries we've been talking about at the intro is healthcare and life sciences for our guests. I think healthcare can be pretty self-explanatory, but how do you classify life sciences? What is included in that industry?
A great question. Life sciences, in the way sort of professionals describe it, as pharmaceuticals, biotech, med device, contract research organizations, contract development manufacturing organizations, all those components sort of under that larger umbrella of life science, where FDA and other regulatory agencies are involved. That's what I call life sciences. So hopefully that explains it a little bit more.
I appreciate that. What is the current landscape in those two industries in M&A right now? What are the major dynamics that people should know? Any headwinds coming up that might shape deal activity in the this year? What does it look like in this industry?
Yeah, I would say 2026 is a market that's reaccelerating after, let's call it, a prolonged reset. It's been pretty challenging over the last let's say 3 years, and I think the reset it is healthy, and even if it was painful, the period from, let's say, 2022, just beyond COVID, to middle of 2024 was defined by valuation correction. You had compressed multiples and a dramatic slowdown in VC deploying into, let's say, early stage life science companies, pharma, biotech, things like that, medical device companies, and a lot of companies that were overcapitalized in the 2020, 2021 timeframe, where, frankly, drunken sailors were spending money like crazy on preclinical companies, and they were going public. And I'm like, this is crazy. This is going to be ending up as a bad story. A lot of those companies were overcapitalized and underperforming, frankly, and they were forced to then make hard choices, either doing a reverse merge, shelving programs, or shutting down entirely. And what survived today at the end of 2025, and we saw a lot of great momentum, and now into 2026, where we're seeing more and more M&A activity as well as partnering activity. We see a leaner, more focused cohort of companies and assets, and that actually creates a very attractive deal environment. So now you have high quality companies. So in looking at, let's call it, on the strategic buyer side, and putting private equity aside, because private equity really doesn't put money per se into life science companies. They're focused more on healthcare companies. Private equity in general doesn't like anything to do with regulatory, like FDA. It's like, forget it, because they're not typically cash flow machines. They're big holes with like a money sink. So on the strategic buyer side, what you had asked about things that are driving M&A, the main engine right now driving activity is the patent cliff. There's a number of these big pharma companies which are having huge revenue holes or revenue gaps because of some key patents going off. You can look at, in the case of like Merck's Keytruda, composition of matter patent is coming off in about another 2 years. Humira just went generic about two and a half, almost 3 years ago. So they're creating, big revenue losses that frankly cannot be offset by internal pipeline productivity alone. They have to look elsewhere through external research and development on these small companies, small research and development, innovative companies that are doing some really incredible things. And so that's really a structural imperative for mergers and acquisition. It's not discretionary spending. You have to do it. And it's sort of an existential threat that your portfolio management must include this. And so that's what's happening in large pharma. And large pharma's got, incredible large balance sheets, a lot of dry powder to spend. So there's a real urgency to deploy the capital, and they're doing that with urgency. And then, so the way, in that low to mid market, let's say that 250 million enterprise value and below, where it's a true middle market for biotech and med tech, I think the constructive signals certainly outweigh any headwinds, and headwinds might be like a lot of things going on at the FDA and in Washington with NIH funding, things like that. That's how these companies, certainly sort of capitally finance themselves. We're seeing more strategic partnership activity as a precursor to full acquisition. We see a lot of option to acquire structures and a real uptick in more and more business development conversations that are moving past just exploratory discussions, but more towards substantive discussions. So I believe that 2026 and 2027 right now are looking like they're going to be very active years. And we're also seeing that in like the IPO market in healthcare and life science as well, where a number of companies are starting to line up. And that's another, exit option. Now, I don't cover that as an investment banker on the IPO side, but a lot of companies are doing parallel processes with either pursuing an M&A or partnering, as well as looking at IPO activity.
What are maybe some key factors that differentiate a successful life science company when it comes to attracting buyers or investors? What are some key components that you see are common?
Well, that's a great question. So being on on both sides of the table, because prior to being an investment banker, I was in strategic biopharma within corporate development for example, like Allergan. I was there for about 12 years doing deals, and we had a very large balance sheet where we were doing a lot of deals, not only partnering deals but M&A deals. Seeing now as an investment banker more on the sell side, there are definitely some differentiating factors, but they're remarkably consistent regardless of which seat I'm sitting in. First, I would say some of the things that, and there's probably about three or four that I can think of. One is clinical credibility. Buyers as well as investors, they just don't fund science projects. They acquire de-risk assets with a mechanistically coherent rationale. So a mechanism of action that they truly understand. There's human proof of concept data and a regulatory pathway that has been stress tested. So those are the things that I see are very, very important. And companies that are successful can articulate that mechanism of action, their patient selection hypothesis, and perhaps their biomarker strategy in a very coherent narrative. And they're dramatically more compelling than those companies that can't really tell that story. So I think that is super critical. Second differentiator is, IP architecture and the quality of that. And that goes beyond just like, hey, I got, 20 patents. Well, that's great. It's about defensibility, freedom to operate, absence of any legacy entanglements that they might have. I mean, I've seen personally a transaction fall apart at the diligence stage because the IP estate contained a co-inventorship dispute that the founding team had minimized. They thought, we'll get it figured out, but they didn't. And frankly, the buyer walked away from it because they didn't want to deal with that. So IP was the second thing. And then third is this, I find this to be underappreciated, is the quality of the management team and that commercial narrative. So as you know, and we started off in our podcast talking about finance and scientists. Well, scientists understandably are trained to communicate about mechanisms, statistical, clinical significance, and reproducibility. And then you have buyers, CFOs, and investment committees hitting on the finance side. And they're trained to think about IRR, risk-adjusted NPV, and addressable market trajectories. And what I find is that, teams that are successful in communicating that narrative can do it fluently in both languages, that sort of the scientifically and the finance side. They can communicate that very fluently without perhaps dumbing down the science and without losing the finance team and all these big, 5-syllable words and jargon and things like that. So I spent a disproportionate amount of my advisory time coaching leaderships on this translation. And it's because of this difference between those processes, I think, creates a very competitive tension, and one that dies in a single buyer exclusive relationship. So those are the things that immediately come to mind.
Yeah, very interesting. And you've done a lot of mentoring of CEOs in your career as well. What are some common, I don't know if it's mistakes or blind spots that you see in these founders and executives when they're looking to exit? And you mentioned, kind of the science component and the finance component. Are these CEOs having both, or are you having to mentor them in one area more than the other?
No, I have to mentor them on a number of things. First of all, when I'm getting involved in an engagement, there's three things that I generally look at a very high level, and then we can certainly peel back the onion. One is, do they have a realistic expectation of their valuation and their goals and objectives? Secondly, do I feel like the deal is transactable, that there are actual buyers out there? And then the third is this a good person? I have the no jerk policy. So I might use a different word sometimes.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right. There you go. Anyway, that's at a very, very high level. And then when you start to pull it back, the things that I start seeing as other factors when I'm mentoring is, and you see this with painful regularity, is a lot of these companies start the process way too late. They come to you with, hey, I only have like 2 or 3 months of cash left. That's going to be a bad recipe. And I frankly, I won't take them. And it comes down to, that's very, very poor leverage to go into an M&A process. When you're entering a process from the position of weakness, not of strength, and you want to go out there a position of strength with data, optionality, and multiple potential partners at the table, where we can control the narrative. But when they're coming into that process very weak, buyers sense it, frankly, and they're going to wait, and the valuation dynamics shift very, very accordingly. We talked about valuation. Don't need to really stress that beyond what I said. There's a lot of times they feel like, hey, I have this $1 billion company, and when you're looking at it going, it's really about $20 million, and so having some realistic expectations on value, I think is super critical. And then you can also then talk about just running that process that we do as M&A advisors, looking at data room, the quality, the process infrastructure. I can tell you how many times that you would be given access to somebody's data room, and it's just really very, very poor. And I think that's reflective on the company and how much they're actually investing into it. And then look, I'm going to toot my horn and your horn in terms of being a good advisor. Frankly, poor advisor selection you see it happen very, very often. And I know it's a very sensitive topic for obvious reasons, but it's super important. Not all, for example, in my area of life science and healthcare, not all M&A advisors understand life sciences deeply enough to be generally credible with both the science community as well as the deal mechanics simultaneously. So, many times I'll run into a company that hires a generalist banker, and they might be really good at modeling a DCF, but they can't hold a credible conversation with a chief medical officer or a head of business development or CEO at a large pharma. And that's a structural disadvantage. So I think that's where the most impactful role of an advisor like myself, I can work at that intersection of the scientific narrative as well as the finance structuring. And I think that requires depth at both positions. I also typically see that when I'm mentoring or even doing a deal.
I mean, taking the industries out of the equation, we're talking about, for an M&A advisor like yourself, it's just industry specialization, is diving into one industry. What other benefits have you seen from just being industry focused and getting right into, and not spreading yourself across multiple industries?
Yeah, it comes down to me, domain expertise. You start building your brand and you become the go-to. I'm getting a lot of calls. Obviously, I'm not getting calls from other industries. They know, hey, if I want to sell my company, I know that I'm a biotech, I'm going to call Cardiff Advisory. So it's about just building that core expertise, knowing what you're good at and knowing your swim lane and not going outside of it. It comes down to domain expertise.
This episode of the M&A Mastermind podcast is powered by Cornerstone International Alliance, where leading M&A firms come together. As part of this international network, you get access to global opportunities, over 200 M&A experts, enhanced collaboration and knowledge sharing, and some of the best M&A tools and resources available, all to help you take your firm to the next level. Ready to join this exclusive network? Visit cornerstoneia.com/new member today. You've done some cross-border transactions. Any nuances to those that our listeners should maybe know about that, if you're looking at maybe doing a cross-border deal or you've only done some, in the States, like anything they should know about that is unique about cross-border deals?
Yeah, it could be humbling. You can't go into the expectation of, hey, this is my experience in running a deal in North America or the United States. It took me 6 months or 9 months. Generally, things and cross-border take a lot longer. It confronts you as an advisor to confront the gap between what you assume might be, hey, this is universal, this will happen, whether it's in North America or in Asia Pacific, for example, and it's deeply cultural. For example, that science might be very universal. A deal that you do in United States versus a deal that you might do in Tokyo is very, very different. Different deal psychology, different decision-making architecture. For example, in Japan, it's consensus building, whereas you can do a deal in the United States, and frankly, you can talk to like one or two people, someone who's controlling the P&L or the president, and they'll make the decision. In Japan, it's consensus building. And so that process is very, very different. And relationships matter in a way on cross-border, in particular in Japan, that requires patience that most US companies have not developed, or they don't have that experience. So a Japanese strategic partner will want multiple in-person meetings, and you have extensive scientific diligence. Even just looking at like Europe, for example, if you're going to do a deal there, Europe will take so much time and go really, really deep on your scientific diligence. And if you can sort of get yourself through that main filter, you're looking at almost a very, very successful partnership. Europeans do so much diligence like I've never seen before. And that's awesome. So if you can get through diligence, and frankly, a lot of North American companies don't expect that's a huge sort of feather in your cap. For me, it's culture is the biggest thing, and just how companies approach diligence as well as the timeline. Those are been my key walkaways with doing cross-border deals.
Yeah. It's a great segue into my next question on due diligence, because in healthcare and life sciences, it can be pretty complex with IP regulatory issues and clinical data integrity and, all that sort of stuff. What do you believe advisors, should know or need to know or should not overlook when evaluating these companies and going through due diligence, related to these topics?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. You had mentioned clinical data integrity in the very broadest sense, and I think that's an underestimated risk. And so one of the things that I always like to tell my client that are selling it, try to put this through a stress test of your own data before the buyer does, because the buyer will find something. You don't want to be in a position where you're being put onto the defensive. So go in, stress test your own data. Statisticians and clinicians and scientists look at data differently than the company may. So stress test your own data before the buyer does, as I mentioned. Run an outside statistical review. Know where your vulnerabilities are on the data before sitting across the table from a very skeptical buyer at that point. Your answers don't always have to be perfect, but the awareness needs to be complete. Secondly, I don't think that companies give a lot of attention to what you call CMC, chemistry, manufacturing, control. That's how drugs are made. So your active drug, how it's formulated, the stability, all the aspects of going into it. And CMC tends to be an afterthought. And I would tell you that a very large number of either drugs are not approved or just refuse to file with a regulatory agency because CMC problems have popped up. And so people who don't spend enough time on that is, frankly, they're doing a disservice to their shareholders, investment. Another one is regulatory pathway nuances, really trying to understand sort of what that defined regulatory path is. That's another very important aspect of going through due diligence and discovery. And then, frankly, and this is, industry agnostic, it's just not specific to healthcare and life science. It's that soft diligence, and that's that, key person risk, organizational culture, employee retention dynamics. Those are super important, well beyond, IP coverage and financial projections. But once, you close the deal on Friday and now it's on, two or three days later on Monday, that's when the real deal starts. Like, hey, if people are starting to walk away and they're in a different type of organizational culture, or, you have a key risk of maybe the founder is leaving, you're losing a lot of institutional knowledge with the company that you just acquired. So those are some of the areas that I frequently spend a lot of time on. It's not sort of post-acquisition, not only on the post-acquisition economics, but post-acquisition sort of logistics.
Integration, right, for sure. What about, you talk about signals and timing, and timing is always important in M&A transactions. You hear too many times that the business owner stayed on too long and whatnot. What are some signals for timing that you see, or some things that we can look at to make to educate the CEOs or the owners about, hey, maybe now's a good time?
Yeah, I think certainly there's one on just the overall macroeconomic signal, whether that has to do with, how IPOs are going or how investors are putting in money. What is the market dynamics going on? And right now you can say like, hey, big pharma and other companies in life science who have large balance sheets are, spending money to beef up their portfolio. That's a great signal. And then secondly, it's all right, but looking at your portfolio and your product candidates, are they de-risked? Are they clearly defined in terms of the regulatory pathway? Investors and buyers want de-risked assets or de-risked companies. They don't want to necessarily put it into just a completely very, very risky proposition. So I think that, the first one, market, and then secondly, what are you doing to de-risk your investment thesis? Those are very, very critical. And frankly, buyers don't really care, in my view, whether you're running out of cash or you can't raise money out in either the private markets or the public markets. They're just looking to, acquire good assets and good companies that represent, strong investment thesis and very compelling proposition for the buyer. And so you have to really de-risk it. That's a critical data component. And then, you have to look at the IP. Am I buying just a commoditized product, or is there some real differentiation, that can be substantiated by data? So those are the ones.
Obviously, industries of high innovation. What's out there in the future. In biotech, medtech. Even digital health impacting these M&A deals. How do you see that playing a role in the next couple of years?
I've never seen so much innovation ever before in my career. I mean, innovation is just, it's going so rapidly, and it's like so cool. Now that's great. And I think it offers a great opportunity for buyers as well as sellers alike. But what I see happening from the M&A advisory standpoint is that deal structures are changing very rapidly to accommodate a lot of the uncertainty that is frankly inherent to cutting edge innovation. And so what we're seeing is, for example, a normalization of milestone heavy earnout structures. And sometimes that's used to bridge the gap between maybe a seller's expectation on value versus a buyer's expectations. So we're seeing, milestone heavy earnout structures. That's a great way when you have that, like I said, that genuine valuation gap. And I think it's or pushing things out towards later. So there might be some small value up front, but it's going to be, all right, but show me your confidence that you're going to get there. I'm going to back end weight this thing. So maybe a little bit up front, heavy milestone structures and that earnout capacity, but putting it more towards, sort of approval. And life science and healthcare are very long development timelines. This is not like doing, a consumer product deal or, manufacturing deal and like, aerospace and defense and things like that. So it's about rational risk allocation. And that's what we're seeing in the space. And then I think just overall, when you start looking at valuations, life science and healthcare go beyond just a traditional discounted cash flow model. As I mentioned, long development timelines, generally not cash flow positive. So EBITDA negative, they're just sucking a lot of your P&L. That might work reasonably well for a single asset company in a defined sort of industry. But in healthcare and life science, to do proper valuation, it's, yes, you use a combination of probability adjusted net present value, real options analysis, or comparable transaction analysis, and benchmark it to sort of construct a range of defensible valuations for these companies. So those are the sort of the big things that I'm seeing right now.
Very interesting. Appreciate that insight. Last question for you, David. This has been amazing. For our audience, what is some practical advice you would give them for just building credibility and success and working in the life sciences space and healthcare space?
Scientific literacy, just like myself, and I can only speak to what has worked with me, and I'm super happy. One post baseball, going and getting all my academic degrees. Scientific literacy, I think it's very, very meaningful. And you don't have to have a PhD in biology to be an effective life science banker, but you should really truly understand and try to connect with the scientists and what they're saying and understand that process. So then you could then also talk to the sort of the finance side of things as well. Secondly, this is a long game, and life science deal cycles are very long. It's very relationship intensive and reputation driven. And, I think my business is more relational banking than it is transactional banking. So you have to really have that patience. You have to treat every interaction as a relationship investment, not just a transactional opportunity, and build that kind of trust network that generally generates deal flow organically. And, frankly, having that sort of following that I do on social media and doing a lot of writing, I think that's super important. I build that over time. And then look, and I think we talked about this. This is my third point is, know your lane and own it. And where you talked about, or I talked about, domain expertise. Life science is exceptionally broad, as I explained to it. Doing a deal in oncology is very different than doing a deal in cardiometabolic disease or neurodegeneration, things like that. Different companies, what have you. So you really need to understand what you're good at, where your core capabilities lie, and sort of try to avoid going down other paths in life science. For example, maybe it's in genetics that I might not have a certain strong core capability, but I know where I'm strong. So stay in your lane and own it. And that's a strategic choice that is generally going to enable genuine depth over comfortable breadth, if that makes sense. So it's about being seen as a credible source for your clients.
Mm-hmm. Amazing, David. This has been so insightful and a lot of great information shared. I appreciate you taking the time to join me, and I know our audience will benefit from this conversation. Where can our audience learn more about you, the great work you're doing? Where can they find you? How can they connect?
Yeah, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's certainly one way, David H. Crean. Also at CardiffAdvisory.com. You can see the website tells you a little bit more about the firm, what we're trying to build, how we, bring value to our clients and the services that we do. So look forward to connecting with your viewership.
Awesome. Thank you, David. I appreciate your time today. That's it. That's all we have for this episode of the M&A Mastermind podcast. Make sure to share, like, and comment on this episode. Pass on to anybody who you think might benefit from our conversation here today. Tune in every Thursday morning for a brand new episode each week. And take care, everybody. Until next time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the M&A Mastermind podcast. And a special thank you to our presenting sponsor, Cornerstone International Alliance. If you enjoyed today's discussion, don't forget to like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. We'll be back next week with more insights, strategies, and real-life experiences to help you take your M&A game to the next level.